Sometimes the simplest act of kindness can change everything. When Elias Thorne opened his cabin door to two freezing dogs during a Montana blizzard, he thought he was just saving a couple of strays from the storm. The aging rancher had lived alone in these mountains for 15 years, and the company of the intelligent Australian shepherds reminded him what it felt like to be needed again. But at sunrise, everything changed. 10 armed mountain men surrounded his cabin, demanding he hand over the dogs. That's when Elias learned the truth. These weren't lost pets. They were the key to a massive federal crime. The outlaws had been stealing army horses and needed those dogs to finish the job. Now Elias faced an impossible choice: surrender the loyal animals to brutal men, or stand his ground against overwhelming odds. What would you do if one act of mercy put your life on the line? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat in a clearing 2 miles above the timberline, where the lodgepole pines gave way to sparse whitebark and the wind carried voices from valleys below. Elias Thorne had built most of it himself over the course of 2 summers, cutting each log by hand, fitting each corner with the precision of a man who had nothing but time. The structure was solid and practical, with a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. It wasn't much, but it was enough for one man who no longer wanted the complications of the world below. He woke before dawn, as he always did, to the sound of absolute silence. That was something people from the valley never understood: the weight of true quiet, the way it pressed against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat. Elias had grown to appreciate it over the 15 years since he'd climbed this mountain and decided not to come back down. The silence meant peace. It meant no one asking questions he didn't want to answer. It meant no sympathetic looks from neighbors who didn't know what to say about Sarah. The morning routine never changed. He lit the fire first, using kindling he'd split the night before, watching the flames catch and spread with the satisfaction of a man who understood the simple mathematics of survival. Heat, food, water, shelter, everything else was just noise. He filled the kettle from the water barrel by the door and set it on the iron stove to boil. While he waited, he pulled on his wool pants and flannel shirt, then his boots, lacing them with the methodical attention he gave to everything. Coffee was a luxury he allowed himself, trading for it twice a year when he made the descent to Timber Ridge for supplies. The rest he grew, hunted, or did without. He'd been a ranch foreman for 20 years before Sarah died, and he knew how to make the land provide. The garden plot behind the cabin would be buried under snow now, but come spring he'd have tomatoes, beans, squash, potatoes. The root cellar was stocked with enough preserves and dried meat to last until April. A man who planned ahead didn't have to depend on anyone. He poured the coffee into a tin cup and sat in the wooden chair by the window, looking out at the world turning grey with pre-dawn light. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, peaks like broken teeth against the sky. Somewhere down in the valley, people were waking up to jobs and families and all the entanglements that made life complicated. Elias had left all that behind. Not left, run from. If he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be in the early morning quiet, he'd run from it all. His hand moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck, finding the ring that hung there. Sarah's wedding ring, simple gold, thin from 43 years of wear. She'd been in the ground for 5 years now, but he still reached for it whenever his thoughts turned dark. It was the only thing he'd kept when he sold the ranch and everything in it. That, and the guilt. He should have seen the signs, the way she'd grown tired so easily that last year, the headaches she'd dismissed as nothing, the weight she'd lost despite eating well. But ranching was demanding work, and they'd both learned to push through discomfort. By the time she finally agreed to see a doctor in Billings, the cancer had spread too far. 3 months later, she was gone. The other ranchers' wives had tried to help him afterward, bringing casseroles, organizing the house, offering to stay with him so he wouldn't be alone. but their kindness had felt like pity, and their presence reminded him of what he'd lost. Every room in the ranch house held Sarah's memory: the kitchen where she'd hummed while cooking, the bedroom where they'd talked late into the night, the porch where they'd planned their future. He couldn't breathe there anymore, so he'd left. Sold everything to the neighboring ranch for less than it was worth, packed what he could carry, and climbed until the air grew thin and cold and clean. Up here, the memories couldn't follow. Up here, he could forget that he'd failed the one person who'd mattered most. Except he hadn't forgotten. The ring on the chain proved that. Elias drained his coffee and stood, pushing away thoughts that served no purpose. The day ahead needed his attention. He stepped outside into the bitter cold of late February, his breath clouding in the frozen air. The sky was the color of old iron, and the wind carried the sharp smell of coming snow. A big storm, if he was reading the signs right. The kind that dropped 3 feet overnight and kept you trapped for days. He spent the morning in preparation. Split more firewood and stacked it against the cabin wall where he could reach it without going far. Checked the chimney flue to make sure it would draw properly in high winds. Brought extra water up from the creek before it froze solid. Moved the supplies from the outer shed to the cabin, everything he might need for a week of being snowbound. A man alone couldn't afford to be caught unprepared. By mid-afternoon, the first flakes were falling, small and dry, the kind that meant serious accumulation. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Elias secured everything outside that might blow away and gave a last look around the clearing. Everything was battened down. He could ride out anything nature threw at him. Inside, he built up the fire and settled into his evening routine. Beans and salt pork for dinner, eaten from the pot while standing by the stove. He wasn't much for ceremony when it was just himself. After eating, he sat in his chair with a book, Marcus Aurelius, the same copy he'd been reading and rereading for 3 years. The Stoic wisdom appealed to him. Accept what you cannot change. Focus on what you can control. Let go of everything else. Good advice, even if he couldn't quite manage to follow it. The wind picked up as darkness fell, howling around the cabin corners and rattling the shutters. Snow was coming down heavy now, visible in the lamplight through the window. Elias added another log to the fire and watched the flames dance. The cabin creaked and settled around him, familiar sounds that had become a kind of companionship. He'd learned to be alone, even if he hadn't quite learned to like it. He was nodding off in his chair when movement outside caught his eye. Something dark against the white snow, moving erratically near the edge of the clearing. Elias stood and pressed his face to the cold glass, squinting into the storm. 2 shapes, low to the ground. His first thought was wolves, but wolves moved with purpose. These shapes stumbled and fell, struggled forward, fell again. Dogs. 2 dogs, fighting their way through snow that was already knee-deep. Elias grabbed his coat and the lantern and pushed out into the blizzard. The wind hit him like a fist, driving snow into his face so hard he could barely see. He held the lantern high and moved toward where he'd seen the shapes. The cold was vicious, the kind that found its way through every layer and straight to the bone. He almost stepped on the first dog before he saw it. An Australian shepherd, its blue merle coat crusted with ice, collapsed in the snow. It raised its head weakly as the light fell on it, and Elias saw intelligence in those eyes, even through the exhaustion. A few feet away, the second dog, Red Merle, smaller, probably female, was trying to crawl forward. Elias didn't hesitate. He'd been a rancher too long to leave animals to die. He tucked the lantern under his arm, scooped up the first dog heavier than he expected, solid muscle under the fur, and carried it toward the cabin. The dog didn't fight him, which told him how close to done it was. He got it inside, deposited it by the fire, and went back for the second one. The female was lighter, but the wind was stronger now, trying to knock him sideways. By the time he got her inside and barred the door behind him, he was breathing hard, and his hands were numb despite the gloves. The storm was a full whiteout now, visibility down to nothing. Another few minutes, and those dogs would have been buried and frozen. He knelt by the fire and examined them properly. Both were in bad shape, ice matted in their fur, paws cracked and bleeding from the cold, shivering so hard their whole bodies shook. But they were breathing, and when he ran his hands over them checking for injuries, he found nothing broken, just exhausted and half frozen. What struck him was their condition underneath the ice and exhaustion. These weren't neglected dogs. Their muscles were well developed, their coats thick and healthy, despite the matting. Someone had fed them well and worked them regularly, and they were trained, he could tell by the way they held themselves, even in distress. When he touched them, they didn't snap or shy away. They accepted his handling with the patience of animals who'd been taught to trust humans. He fetched towels and rubbed them down, working the ice from their fur, massaging warmth back into their legs and paws. They submitted to his care without resistance, watching him with alert eyes that seemed too intelligent for simple house pets. Working dogs, then. Probably from one of the big ranches in the valley. Maybe they'd gotten separated from their owner during the storm, wandered too far, gotten lost. Elias heated water and mixed it with some of the dried meat from his stores, making a warm mash. He set the bowls down and watched the dogs eat slowly, carefully, with none of the desperate gulping of starving animals. Even hungry and hurt, they had discipline. Impressive. As they ate, he noticed the collars. Heavy leather, well made, with brass rings for leashes. Quality work, the kind that cost real money. These were valuable animals. Someone down in the valley was probably sick with worry, wondering where their dogs had gone in the storm. He'd have to take them back once the weather cleared. The thought brought an unexpected pang of reluctance. It had been a long time since he'd had company of any kind, even the four-legged variety. The cabin felt different with them, in it warmer somehow, less empty. They were just dogs, but their presence reminded him what it felt like to be needed, to have something depending on him for care and protection. Sarah would have loved them. She'd always wanted dogs when they were ranching, but there'd never been time, never been room in the busy schedule. Always next year, they'd said. Next year when things settled down. Next year when they had a moment to breathe. Next year had never come. The dogs finished eating and moved closer to the fire, settling down on the warm stones with contented sighs. The male rested his head on his paws, but kept his eyes on Elias, watchful even in exhaustion. The female curled into a tight ball, her breathing already evening out into sleep. Elias sat back in his chair and watched them. The storm raged outside, shaking the cabin, but inside it was warm and quiet and almost peaceful. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't completely alone. It was temporary, he knew that. Come morning, he'd figure out where they belonged and get word to their owner somehow. But for tonight, for this one night, he had company. His hand found Sarah's ring again, turning it between his fingers. She would have told him this was good for him. She would have said he'd been alone too long, that hiding in the mountains wasn't the same as healing. She'd always been able to see through him, see the things he tried to hide even from himself. The fire crackled and popped. The wind howled. The dogs slept peacefully, their sides rising and falling in steady rhythm. Elias felt his own eyes growing heavy, the warmth and the long day catching up with him. He should move to the bed, but the chair was comfortable and the fire was warm, and the dogs were right there where he could keep an eye on them. Just for a few minutes, he told himself, just until the storm eases. Outside, snow piled higher and higher, burying the world in white. Inside, the cabin held its warmth and light, a small sanctuary against the vast, cold night. The dogs dreamed whatever dogs dream, safe and warm, for the first time in days. And Elias Thorne, who had spent 5 years running from connection, slept with the faintest trace of peace on his weathered face. He didn't know that sunrise would change everything. He didn't know that those 2 innocent animals sleeping by his fire would force him to make a choice that would define what kind of man he truly was. He didn't know that by morning 10 armed men would surround his cabin, and his quiet life of isolation would be shattered forever. For now, there was only warmth and peace, and the comfort of not being alone. For now, that was enough. Dawn came quiet and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the dark hours. Elias woke to a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that follows heavy snowfall when the world is muffled under a white blanket. He was still in his chair, neck stiff from the awkward angle. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The cabin was cold enough that he could see his breath. The dogs were awake, standing by the door with their ears pricked forward. Not the relaxed alertness of animals wanting to go outside, but something sharper, tense. The male, the blue merle, had his hackles slightly raised, and a low rumble came from deep in his chest. Elias straightened slowly, every joint protesting. Something was wrong. The dogs felt it, and now he felt it too. A prickling at the back of his neck, the same instinct that had warned him of trouble back in his ranching days when rustlers prowled the boundary fences. Then he heard it. Boots crunching through snow, not one person but several, moving with purpose, surrounding the cabin in a pattern that spoke of coordination and experience. He moved to the window and peered through the gap in the shutters. What he saw made his chest tighten. 10 men stood in a rough semicircle around the front of his cabin, all armed, all watching his door with the patience of people who knew they had the advantage. They wore heavy coats and furs, their faces weathered and hard, the kind of men who lived rough and thought nothing of it. Most carried rifles. A few had pistols visible at their hips. None of them looked like they were here for a friendly visit. Before Elias could process what he was seeing, the pounding started. Heavy, rhythmic blows against his door, not fists, but rifle butts. The sound echoed through the small cabin like drumbeats, meant to intimidate. The dogs backed away from the door, growling low but not barking. They knew danger when they saw it. "We know you're in there." The voice was rough and commanding, used to being obeyed. "Open the door, old man. We need to talk." Elias took a breath, steadying himself. His Winchester was leaning against the wall by his bed, but reaching for it now would be foolish. 10 armed men. Even if he got a few shots off, they'd rush the cabin, and it would be over. Better to find out what they wanted, buy time to think. He unbarred the door and stepped outside, closing it firmly behind him so the dogs couldn't follow. The cold hit him immediately. He'd come out without his coat, wearing just his flannel shirt. The men spread out slightly as he emerged, giving themselves clear lines of fire if it came to that. Professional, organized, not random thugs or drifters. The man who'd shouted stepped forward. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with a scar running from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Grey streaked his dark hair, and his eyes were the flat, emotionless grey of a winter sky. He carried authority like a weapon, and the other men deferred to him with small shifts of posture and glances. "Name's Garrett Kane," the man said without preamble. "You got something that belongs to me, and I'm here to collect it." Elias kept his face neutral, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. "Don't believe I've taken anything from you." "The dogs," Kane's voice was flat. "2 Australian shepherds. They wandered off during the storm last night. I tracked them here." Elias glanced around the clearing. The snow was deep and unmarked except for the tracks the men had made coming in. "Don't see any dog tracks. How'd you know they came to my cabin?" "Because there's nowhere else they could have gone." Kane took another step closer. "Now, I'm being reasonable here. I'm not accusing you of stealing. I'm just saying those dogs belong to me. They got lost, and I need them back. Simple as that." There was nothing simple about it. Elias had lived through enough range disputes and territory fights to recognize a threat dressed up as civility. These men hadn't climbed this mountain in a blizzard's aftermath to politely ask for lost pets. They needed those dogs, needed them badly enough to bring 10 armed men to collect them. "They're in rough shape," Elias said carefully. "Half frozen when I found them. Been working to get them warmed up. Maybe in a day or 2. Now," Kane's voice hardened, "I need them now. And I'm saying they need rest. Push them too hard in this cold. They won't make it down the mountain. One of the younger men behind Kane shifted impatiently, his hand moving toward his rifle. Kane raised a hand slightly, and the man froze. The gesture told Elias everything. These men were disciplined, following orders, waiting for Kane's signal. Former military, maybe, or at least trained by someone who knew tactics. "Look," Kane said, his tone shifting toward something that might have been patience. "I understand you're trying to help, but those dogs represent a considerable investment. They're trained working animals, worth more than this whole cabin. I can't leave them here." "What kind of work?" Elias asked. The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Several of the men exchanged glances. Kane's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Herding," he said finally. "Sheep, cattle, standard ranch work." It was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Elias had been around working dogs his entire life, and while these two were clearly trained, there was something different about them. The way they responded to threats, the discipline in their bearing, the quality of their conditioning, this went beyond ranch work. "Those are expensive collars for ranch dogs," Elias observed. "I pay for quality. Heavy leather, brass fittings. Look military grade to me." Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The dogs." Now, another voice spoke up from the group, younger and less controlled than Kane. "Boss, we don't have time for this. We need to move the—" He cut off abruptly as Kane shot him a look that could have frozen water. "Move what?" Elias's mind raced through the possibilities. These men were running some kind of operation, something that required those specific dogs, something time-sensitive. Up here in the high country, with this many armed men, that meant smuggling or rustling or something equally illegal. He thought about the collars again, how well made they were, and suddenly he saw them differently. Not just heavy leather, but government-issue leather. Not just brass rings, but brass rings designed for military or federal equipment. "Let me see one of those dogs again," Elias said. "Check their condition before I hand them over." Before Kane could respond, Elias turned and stepped back inside the cabin. The dogs were there, still alert, still watching the door. He knelt beside the male and ran his hand along the collar, turning it until he found what he was looking for. Stamped into the brass ring, almost worn away but still visible, U.S. Property. His blood went cold. These weren't ranch dogs, these were government dogs. Army dogs most likely trained for military work, and these men had them, which meant they'd stolen them. And if they'd stolen government dogs, what else had they stolen? The younger man's slip echoed in his mind. "We need to move the horses." They were moving horses, stolen army horses, probably from the cavalry post down in Fort Benton. Using these trained herding dogs to control and drive them through the mountain passes where the army couldn't follow. It was bold, organized, and exactly the kind of operation that would require men like these. And now Elias was standing in the middle of it. He walked back outside, leaving the door open this time so the dogs could see him. Kane was watching him with those flat grey eyes, reading his body language, probably seeing the moment Elias understood what he was holding. "Found something interesting?" Kane asked softly. "Government property," Elias said. "Those collars say U.S. property, which means you didn't buy these dogs, you stole them." The clearing went very still. The men's hands moved almost imperceptibly toward their weapons. Kane raised his hand again, holding them back, but the message was clear. They would kill him if Kane gave the word. Out here, this far from town, his body wouldn't be found until spring thaw, if ever. "That's a serious accusation," Kane said. "It's a serious crime. Federal crime, I'd imagine. Stealing from the army." Elias kept his voice level, conversational, despite the fear creeping up his spine. "I'm guessing you're using these dogs to move horses. Probably stolen army horses, through the passes where the cavalry can't follow. Smart operation, professional, but you need those dogs to make it work. That's why you're here with 10 armed men. That's why you can't wait." Kane studied him for a long moment, then smiled without humor. "You're a clever man. That's unfortunate. I don't want trouble. But I'm not handing over stolen government property to help you commit federal crimes." "Those dogs are the least of what we've taken," Kane said quietly. "And the horses need to move through the pass in the next 3 days while the weather holds. Without those dogs, we can't control a herd that size. Without those dogs, we lose everything." "That's not my problem." "It's about to be." Kane's voice hardened again. "I'm going to make this simple for you, old man. You have until sunset to decide. Hand over those dogs willingly, and we'll leave you in peace. Keep them, and we'll come. Take them, and we'll burn this cabin to the ground with you in it. Your choice." The men started backing away, maintaining their weapons' aim until they were a safe distance. Kane was the last to turn, calling over his shoulder, "Sunset. Think about it. Think about whether 2 dogs are worth dying for." Elias watched them move through the snow to the tree line, where they set up a rough camp within sight of the cabin, close enough to watch him, close enough to move fast if he tried to run. He was surrounded, outgunned, and facing a deadline that left him hours to decide whether to compromise his principles or stand his ground against impossible odds. He went back inside and closed the door, his hands shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline. The dogs watched him, those intelligent eyes seeming to understand that their fate and his hung in the balance. His hand found Sarah's ring beneath his shirt, gripping it tight. She would have told him the right thing to do. She would have reminded him that some things were worth standing for, even when it cost you everything. Elias looked at the dogs, at their trust and loyalty, at the way they'd accepted his care without question. They were innocent in all this. They hadn't chosen to be stolen, hadn't chosen to be tools for criminals. They'd just been trying to survive the storm. He couldn't hand them over. Not to men like Kane. Not to face whatever brutal work awaited them in those mountain passes, which meant he had until sunset to figure out how one aging rancher could defend himself against 10 armed outlaws who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by killing him. The dogs moved closer, pressing against his legs as if offering comfort, or maybe asking for protection they sensed they'd need. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the clouds, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Beautiful day for winter. Beautiful day to die, if it came to that. Elias picked up his Winchester and checked the chamber. 5 rounds. He had maybe 20 more scattered around the cabin, against 10 men with military training and no mercy. Sunset couldn't be more than 8 hours away. He had work to do. Elias moved through the cabin with methodical purpose, taking stock of everything he had that might keep him alive past sunset. 1 Winchester model, 1894, his grandfather's rifle, lever action and reliable. 1 double-barrel shotgun, loaded with buckshot, good for close work if they breached the door. 23 rounds for the Winchester, counted twice to be sure. A box of shotgun shells, maybe 30. 2 hunting knives, an axe by the woodpile, against 10 rifles and however many pistols they carried. The mathematics weren't encouraging. He went to the window and studied the mountain men's camp through his field glasses. They'd set up about 200 yards out, just inside the tree line where they had cover but could still watch the cabin. Smart positioning. They'd built a fire they could afford to, knowing Elias wasn't going anywhere. Some were sitting, some standing guard, but all of them looked comfortable, unhurried. They had time, they had numbers, they had patience. Kane stood apart from the others, giving orders Elias couldn't hear. The men responded with nods and quick movements, no arguments or discussion, military discipline or something close to it. These weren't ranch hands or drifters. They'd worked together before, trusted each other's skills, knew how to operate as a unit. Elias counted weapons again. 10 rifles he could see, probably more pistols hidden under coats. At least 2 of the men had binoculars trained on his cabin. They were watching for any sign he was preparing to fight or run. Either option would probably end with the same result. His mind drifted back 20 years, to a spring when rustlers had hit the ranch 3 times in 2 months. Small gang, 5 men, taking cattle in the night and disappearing into the hills. The other ranchers had wanted to form a posse, ride out guns blazing, but Elias had been foreman then, responsible for the safety of everyone who worked the land. He'd advocated for patience, for planning, for letting the law handle it. It had worked. The marshal had caught them trying to sell stolen beef in Helena, brought them back in chains. No one had died. No blood had soaked into the soil. But the law wasn't coming this time. No one knew he was in trouble. No one even knew those dogs were here. He was alone, and the situation required a different kind of solution. He turned from the window and looked at the dogs. They'd settled near the fire, staying close to each other but keeping their eyes on him, waiting to see what he'd do, trusting that he'd figure something out. "Wish you could tell me who you belong to," he said quietly. "Wish you could tell me how you ended up with men like that." The male scout, he'd decided to call him, tilted his head at the sound of Elias's voice. The female keeper thumped her tail once against the floor. Small gestures, but they reminded him why he couldn't just hand them over. These were good dogs, loyal dogs, animals who deserved better than to be tools for criminals. He knelt beside Scout and examined the collar more carefully in the morning light. The leather was thick and supple, treated to resist water and wear. The brass ring wasn't decorative, it was functional, designed for attaching leads or securing the dog during transport, and the stamp, U.S. property, was official, the kind pressed into government equipment with authority and permanence. His fingers traced the letters, feeling their depth. Someone in the army had cared enough to mark these dogs as valuable property, had invested time and money in their training. Shepherd dogs didn't learn the kind of discipline these two showed without months, maybe years, of careful work. And someone had stolen them, along with however many horses they were supposed to guard. Elias stood and moved to the back window, checking the terrain behind the cabin. Steep slope rising toward the mountain peak, rock and ice, impossible to climb quickly. That's why he'd built here, natural defense from behind, clear line of sight to the front. It was a good position for defending against predators or weather. Not so good for defending against 10 determined men. He tested the dogs with simple commands, hand signals he'd used with working dogs back on the ranch. Sit, stay, come. They responded instantly, perfectly, their eyes never leaving his hands. When he whistled low, both dogs dropped flat to the floor, motionless. Military response. These dogs had been trained for dangerous situations, for following orders in chaos. That training might keep them alive when things went bad. If things went bad. When things went bad, around midday, movement at the camp caught his attention. One of the younger men was walking toward the cabin, hands visible and empty, a white cloth tied to his rifle barrel. A flag of truce, the old signal that meant talk, not fight. Elias picked up the Winchester and stepped outside, keeping the rifle pointed at the ground but ready. The cold air bit at his lungs. The sun was brilliant on the new snow, making him squint. The young man stopped 20 feet away. He was maybe 25, with a scraggly beard and nervous eyes. Not a hardened outlaw, not yet. Still had conscience written on his face. Still looked like someone who might regret what was about to happen. "Mr. Kane sent me," the young man said. His voice carried across the snow. "But he needs those dogs, and he's hoping we can settle this peaceful-like." "I'm listening," Elias said. "He's offering $500, cash money. For the dogs, no questions asked. You keep the money, we take the dogs, everybody walks away." $500 was real money, more than Elias spent in a year up here. It was also confirmation of everything he'd figured out. They needed those dogs desperately. Needed them badly enough to offer serious money, needed them so much that 10 armed men had climbed a mountain in winter. "What's your name, son?" Elias asked. "Pike." "Well, Caleb, you seem like a decent young man, so I'm going to tell you straight I'm not selling. Those dogs are stolen government property, and I'm not helping criminals commit federal crimes for any amount of money. Pike shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Mr. Kane figured you'd say that. He wanted me to tell you the horses we're moving. They're going through the pass in 3 days. Weather window won't last longer than that. Without those dogs, we can't control the herd, which means we lose everything, which means we got nothing to lose by taking them from you by force. That's a threat. That's reality. Pike looked genuinely sorry. We got 60 horses to move, army horses, yeah, you figured that right, worth $20,000 on the other side of the border. That's more money than most of us will see in a lifetime. You think any of us are going to let 2 dogs stand between us and that kind of money? 60 horses. The scope of it made Elias's chest tight. This wasn't some small-time rustling operation. This was organized theft on a scale that would have the army turning over every rock in Montana. The pass, Elias said, thinking it through. You said 3 days. Why 3 days? Pike hesitated, then shrugged. Weather. The pass snows in pretty regular this time of year. Right now it's clear, but there's another storm coming end of the week. Miss that window, and we're stuck until April. Can't hold 60 horses hidden that long. Can't feed them. Can't risk the army finding them. And there it was. The leverage Elias needed. Time wasn't on Kane's side. Time was on his. Every hour Elias held those dogs, Kane's operation got closer to failure. The weather window was closing. The horses couldn't wait. And without the dogs to control the herd through difficult mountain terrain, Kane couldn't complete the theft, which meant Kane would get more desperate, more dangerous, more willing to do whatever it took. But it also meant Elias had value, not much, but something. As long as he had the dogs, he had leverage. Tell Mr. Kane I appreciate the offer, Elias said, but the answer's still no. Pike nodded slowly, like he'd expected nothing else. He's going to come for them at sunset. You know that, right? He's going to come, and he's going to take them. And if you get in the way, he stopped, leaving the rest unspoken. I understand the situation. Do you? Pike's voice cracked slightly. Do you understand he'll kill you? That he's killed before, lots of times, and one more won't cost him any sleep? I seen him shoot a man in Butte over $30. He didn't hesitate, didn't blink, just drew and fired and left the body in the street. Why are you telling me this? Because you seem like a good man, and I don't want to be part of killing a good man over dogs. Pike looked miserable. But I will be, because Mr. Kane gives orders, and we follow them, and that's how it works. He turned and started walking back toward the camp, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Elias watched him go, understanding that Pike had just given him as much warning as he dared. The young man had conscience enough to regret what was coming, but not courage enough to stop it. Elias went back inside and barred the door. The sun was past its peak now, starting the long slide toward evening. Maybe 4 hours until sunset. Maybe 4 hours to live, if he couldn't figure out a way to survive what was coming. He picked up his grandfather's Winchester and held it in both hands, feeling its weight. The old man had carried this rifle through 3 decades of homesteading, had used it to defend his family from raiders and outlaws when the law was just a word and the nearest marshal was a week's ride away. He'd stood his ground when standing meant survival, and he'd passed the rifle down with the understanding that some things were worth defending. Land, family, principles. Elias had failed to defend his wife from cancer, failed to save the one person who'd mattered most. He'd run from that failure and hidden in these mountains for 5 years. Maybe it was time to stop running. He began moving furniture, creating defensive positions around the cabin. The heavy table went in front of the window, giving him cover while maintaining a shooting angle. The bed frame he angled across the door. Another barrier if they tried to rush in. It wouldn't stop them long, but every second mattered in a gunfight. The dogs watched him work, understanding on some level that preparation meant danger coming. They stayed close but out of the way, ready to respond to whatever happened next. Outside, the sun continued its descent. Inside, an old rancher prepared to make his stand. Some things, he'd decided, were worth defending, even if it cost him everything. The afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful, Elias thought distantly. His last afternoon might be beautiful. There was some justice in that, even if it was cold comfort. He'd finished the basic fortifications and now moved on to details that might matter in close fighting. He filled empty bottles with water and placed them around the cabin. If they set fire to the place, he'd need something to fight the flames. He opened boxes of ammunition and distributed rounds within easy reach of his defensive positions. He loaded the shotgun and propped it by the front window, where he could grab it quickly. The Winchester stayed in his hands, familiar and solid. His mind kept working through scenarios, testing strategies. If they rushed all at once from the front, he might get 3, maybe 4 before they breached the door, but they wouldn't do that. They were too smart, too experienced. They'd split up, come from multiple angles, use covering fire to keep him pinned while others advanced. Standard military tactics for overwhelming a fixed position. He had the high ground in a sense. The cabin's elevated position meant they'd be climbing through snow to reach him. That would slow them down, make them work for every foot. But 10 men could afford to take casualties. He couldn't afford to miss. The dogs had been quiet all afternoon, sensing his tension. Scout remained alert, positioned where he could see the door and windows. Keeper stayed closer to Elias, following him as he moved around the cabin, offering silent companionship that he found oddly comforting. They couldn't understand the danger in human terms, but they understood enough. They knew threats were gathering, knew their human was preparing for conflict. Elias stopped his preparations and knelt beside them, running his hands through their thick fur. They leaned into his touch, soaking up the attention. For a moment, he let himself imagine a different life, one where he'd kept the ranch, where Sarah had lived, where they'd gotten dogs like these and spent peaceful evenings together. A life where he wasn't alone, wasn't waiting for violence, wasn't measuring his remaining time in hours. "Sorry I got you into this," he murmured. "You deserved better than getting caught between criminals and a stubborn old man." Scout licked his hand, a simple gesture of affection and trust that hit harder than it should have. These dogs had been stolen, abused, worked until they'd nearly died in a blizzard, and still they offered loyalty to someone who'd shown them basic kindness. They were better than most people Elias had known. He stood and returned to the window, checking the enemy camp again. The men were more active now, moving with purpose, checking weapons, gathering equipment, getting ready. Sunset was perhaps 2 hours away, and they were preparing for the assault. Kane stood in the center of it all, pointing and directing, his scarred face set in hard lines even at this distance. The smart move would be to surrender, hand over the dogs, save his life, let someone else deal with the federal crime. It wasn't his responsibility to enforce the law up here. It wasn't his fight. Except it was. The moment he'd brought those dogs inside, the moment he'd fed them and cared for them, he'd made it his fight. And the moment he'd seen that government stamp and understood what these men were doing, he'd made a choice about what kind of man he wanted to be. Sarah used to say that character wasn't what you did when people were watching, but what you did when no one would ever know. Up here, 2 miles above the timberline, with no witnesses and no law to hold him accountable, he could make any choice he wanted. He could be pragmatic, surrender, survive, or he could be the man she'd married, the man who believed some things mattered more than survival. His hand found her ring again, that unconscious gesture he'd repeated 10,000 times in 5 years. A small anchor to memory and love and everything he'd lost. She wouldn't want him to die for 2 dogs. She'd want him to be sensible, to live, to maybe find his way back down the mountain someday and rejoin the world. But she'd also raised 3 children to understand right from wrong, had volunteered at the church every Sunday, had believed in doing the right thing even when it cost you, especially when it cost you. and she'd loved animals with a fierce protectiveness that had once led her to stand down a cattle buyer who'd mistreated a horse in their yard. She would have kept the dogs. She would have made the stand. The thought brought something close to peace. If he died here today, at least he'd die doing something she would have understood, something she would have been proud of, even if she'd have been terrified for him. A sound from outside pulled him back to the present, footsteps in the snow, deliberate and loud. Someone approaching alone, making noise to announce their presence. Not an attack, then. Not yet. Elias moved to the side of the window, where he could see, without being an easy target. Kane was walking toward the cabin, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his hands visible and empty. He stopped 30 feet out and called loudly enough to be heard through the walls. "Mr. Thorne, I'd like to talk. Last chance to settle this without blood." Elias considered staying silent, but information was valuable and conversations could reveal things. He cracked the door open but stayed behind its cover, the Winchester ready. "I'm listening." "You've made your point," Kane said. His voice was different now, less threatening, more reasonable, almost friendly. "You're a man of principle. I respect that. But principles don't stop bullets. And I've got 10 men who'll follow my orders without question. This doesn't have to end with you dead." "What are you proposing?" "I've talked to my men. We're willing to go to $1,000. That's more than you'd make in 5 years up here. Take the money, give us the dogs, and we'll pretend this never happened. You can go back to your peaceful life, and we'll move our operation elsewhere. Everyone wins. $1,000. The amount was staggering, and the fact that Kane had doubled his offer told Elias how desperate the situation had become. They needed those dogs. The whole operation hung on getting them back. "And if I refuse?" Elias asked. "Then my men will come at sunset, and they'll take the dogs, and you'll die defending them. And tomorrow nobody will remember your name or care why you died. You'll just be another old man who picked the wrong fight." Kane paused, letting that sink in. "Is that really how you want this to end? Dying for 2 dogs that don't even belong to you?" "They don't belong to you either," Elias said. "They belong to the United States Army, and what you're doing is a federal crime." "Federal crime," Kane laughed. But there was no humor in it. "The Army's got thousands of horses, dozens of dogs. They won't miss these. And even if they come looking, you think they'll find us? We'll be across the border in 4 days, and those horses will disappear into Canada, where nobody asks questions if the price is right." 60 horses, Elias said. $20,000. That's what Pike told me. That's a lot of money to risk losing over 2 dogs. Kane's expression shifted slightly, annoyance flickering across his scarred face. Pike had talked too much. "It's enough money that we're not leaving without them." Which brings us back to the question, do you die for them, or do you take the $1,000 and live? Elias thought about the money, about what he could do with $1,000, about the supplies it would buy, the improvements to the cabin, the security it would provide, about how it would make his isolated life more comfortable, more sustainable. Then he thought about Scout and Keeper, sleeping peacefully by the fire last night, trusting him completely, about the U.S. property stamp on their collars, about the Army handlers who'd trained them and probably mourned their loss, about what it meant to stand for something, even when standing cost everything. "No deal," he said. Kane stood very still for a long moment. "You're a fool." "Maybe, but I'm a fool who can live with himself." "You're a fool who won't live past sunset." Kane's voice went flat and cold. "Last chance, old man. Last offer. Take the money or take the consequences. I've made my choice. Then so have I." Kane turned and walked back toward his camp, his spine straight, his steps measured. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Negotiation was over. Violence was coming. Elias closed the door and barred it again, his heart hammering. His hands shook slightly as he checked the Winchester's action, making sure it would cycle smoothly when he needed it. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 6 shots before he'd need to reload. 6 chances to make a difference. The sun was dropping fast now, painting the snow in shades of red and orange, blood and fire colors. Appropriate. He took his position by the front window, the Winchester resting on the overturned table, giving him a stable shooting platform. Scout lay to his left, Keeper to his right, both dogs calm but alert, waiting with him, ready for whatever came next. The enemy camp was moving with purpose now, men grabbing rifles, checking equipment, forming into two groups. The assault teams. They'd hit from multiple directions, as he'd predicted. Try to divide his attention, overwhelm his defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. Maybe an hour of daylight left, maybe less. Elias's mouth was dry, his palms were sweating despite the cold. Fear was a physical thing in his chest, tight and sharp, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like acceptance, or maybe peace. He'd made his choice, he'd chosen to stand. Whatever happened next, he'd face it knowing he'd done what he believed was right. Sarah's ring pressed against his chest, warm and constant. She'd been buried in the Valley Cemetery, surrounded by friends and family, with her children at the graveside. A proper burial, with mourning and respect and love. If he died here, his body wouldn't be found until spring. Nobody would mourn, nobody would remember. But he'd know. In whatever moments remained to him, he'd know he'd stood for something. Sometimes that had to be enough. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the sky. The mountain men rose from their camp, weapons ready, faces set with grim determination. Kane raised his hand, giving final orders Elias couldn't hear. Then the hand dropped, and they started forward through the snow. It was time. The first shot came from somewhere Elias hadn't expected, from the right, up in the rocks behind the tree line. It punched through his front window and buried itself in the back wall with a solid thunk. Covering fire, meant to keep his head down while the others advanced. He ducked behind the table, heart racing, mind cataloguing information with the cold clarity fear sometimes brings. They had a sniper positioned high, good angle on the cabin's front. That was smart. Professional. He'd have to move carefully, expose himself minimally, or that sniper would end this fight before it started. Through the broken window, he could see the assault teams moving. 5 men coming straight up the middle, spread out, using the natural cover of snowdrifts and scattered rocks. The other 3, the sniper was already positioned, were swinging wide to his left, trying to get around to the side where the cabin was most vulnerable. Classic pincer movement. Keep him focused on the frontal assault while the flanking team hit from the blind spot. Elias shifted to the left window, moving low and fast. Scout followed him instinctively, staying close to the floor. Good dog. Smart dog. Keeping out of the line of fire like he'd been trained. From the side window, Elias could see the flanking team moving through deeper snow, working harder to advance. 3 men, rifles ready, spacing themselves to minimize the risk from a single shooter. They were maybe 80 yards out, well within rifle range if he could get a clear shot. He braced the Winchester against the window frame, found the lead man in his sights, breathed out slowly. The man was moving steadily, confidently, not expecting resistance from this angle yet. Elias led him slightly, accounting for movement and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked loud in the confined cabin. The lead man stumbled, grabbed his shoulder, went down in the snow, not dead, but out of the fight. The other 2 immediately dove for cover, returning fire, bullets smacking into the cabin walls and window frame. Elias ducked back, levered another round into the chamber, moved to a different position. Never stay where you shoot from. Basic survival. The sniper would have marked his muzzle flash, would be adjusting aim, waiting for him to pop up again in the same spot. More shots from the front. The frontal assault team was pushing harder now, using the distraction to close distance. They were maybe 50 yards out, moving fast through the snow. Elias returned to the front window, found a target, fired. Missed the man, dove sideways, and Elias's bullet kicked up snow where he'd been. 3 rounds left in the Winchester, Had to make them count. The flanking team was moving again, more cautious now but still advancing. One of them was shouting orders, coordinating with the frontal assault. Smart. They were going to hit him from both sides simultaneously, split his attention, overwhelm his ability to defend both approaches. Elias grabbed the shotgun, positioned it by the side window where he could reach it fast. The Winchester was for distance work, but if they got close enough to rush the cabin, he'd need the shotgun's stopping power. 2 barrels, 2 shots, then he'd be reloading while they crashed through the door. He risked a quick look at the dogs. Scout was pressed against the back wall, still and alert. Keeper had moved under the bed frame, getting herself into the most protected spot available. They understood danger in a way that transcended training. They understood survival. "Stay down," Elias said, knowing they couldn't understand the words but hoping they'd understand the tone. "Stay quiet and stay down." Another volley from the sniper, multiple shots rapid fire, walking bullets across the cabin's front. One punched through near Elias's head, showering him with splinters. Close, too close. That sniper knew his business. The frontal assault team was inside 30 yards now, close enough that Elias could see their faces, see the determination and professional focus. These weren't random outlaws. These were men who'd done this before, who knew how to assault a position, who wouldn't stop until they'd accomplished their objective or died trying. Elias lined up another shot, aimed carefully, fired. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder, and one of the advancing men spun sideways, his rifle flying from his hands. He went down hard and didn't move. 2 rounds left. The other 4 barely hesitated. They kept coming, spreading wider, making themselves harder targets. Discipline, training. The kind of coordination that came from working together, trusting each other, following a plan. From the side, the flanking team opened up with sustained fire, forcing Elias to keep his head down. He heard them shouting, coordinating their advance with the frontal assault. Any second now they'd rush both positions at once, and he wouldn't be able to stop them all. He fired his last 2 rounds at the frontal assault, forcing them to take cover behind a large rock outcropping 20 yards out. Then he dropped the Winchester and grabbed the shotgun, moving to the side window in time to see the flanking team making their final push. They were close now, maybe 20 yards, running hard through the snow. Elias leveled the shotgun, waited until they were 15 yards out, close enough that the buckshot wouldn't spread too wide, and fired the first barrel. The lead man went down, screaming. The second man hesitated, and Elias fired the second barrel. The man fell backward, and the third man dove behind a snow-covered boulder, shouting curses that carried clearly through the broken window. Elias broke the shotgun open, fumbling for shells from his pocket. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline making his fingers clumsy. He got the first shell in, then the second, snapped, the breech closed. Behind him, he could hear scrambling at the front of the cabin. The frontal assault team was moving up while he'd been focused on the flanking attack. No time to reload the Winchester. He grabbed it and used it as a club, smashing at grasping hands that came through the broken front window. Someone yelled in pain. Someone else was working at the door, trying to force it open against the barricade. The cabin was chaos, gunfire, shouting, the sound of wood splintering. Scout was barking now, deep and aggressive, warning sounds that spoke of dogs bred to protect. Keeper had emerged from under the bed, teeth bared, ready to defend if anyone got through. Elias swung the Winchester again, caught someone's wrist, heard bone break. The man fell back, cursing. But there were too many of them, coming from too many directions. The door was starting to give, the barricade shifting under repeated blows from rifle butts and boots. Then everything changed. A new sound cut through the chaos, a sound that didn't belong, that made no sense in context. A whistle, long and piercing, carrying across the snow from somewhere in the distance. Not a signal from Kane's men, something else entirely. The attack stopped, just stopped, mid-motion, as if someone had called time out in the middle of a brawl. The men at the window backed off. The pounding on the door ceased. Even the sniper went silent. Elias pressed against the wall, shotgun ready, not understanding what was happening. Through the broken windows he could hear voices, urgent and confused. Someone was shouting questions. Someone else was running back toward the main camp. He risked a look outside. The mountain men were retreating, moving back toward the tree line in controlled but hasty fashion, not running but definitely withdrawing. Something had changed. Something had interrupted the assault with enough authority that even Kane's disciplined fighters had abandoned their attack mid-stride. From the tree line came raised voices, an argument in progress. Elias couldn't make out words, but he could hear anger, confusion, authority being questioned and reasserted. The assault teams regrouped at the camp, weapons still ready but attention divided now. Then Elias saw what had changed everything. Riders. Coming up the mountain from the valley, a dozen of them at least, moving fast despite the snow. They were still distant, maybe 10 minutes out, but even from here Elias could see something that made his chest tight with desperate hope. The lead rider carried a flag, a United States flag, snapping in the wind. The cavalry, the actual, literal cavalry, was coming up the mountain. But how? How could they possibly know? Elias had told no one, had no way to send word. The dogs couldn't have summoned help. Nothing about this made sense. At Kane's camp, the argument was getting heated. Through his field glasses, Elias could see Kane pointing at the approaching riders, then at the cabin, clearly trying to decide whether they had time to finish the assault before the army arrived. The other men were shaking their heads, already moving to pack up their gear. Some of them were already disappearing into the trees, heading for escape routes while they still could. Kane stood alone for a long moment, staring at the cabin with pure hatred on his scarred face. Then he made a gesture, sharp and angry, and his remaining men scattered. They melted into the forest like smoke, practiced at disappearing when authority arrived. Within minutes, the camp was empty, except for 2 bodies in the snow, Elias's handiwork, men who'd never get up again. The riders were closer now, close enough that Elias could see they were cavalry indeed, with an officer in the lead and troopers in formation behind him. They rode with the confidence of men who expected to find trouble and knew how to handle it when they did. Elias lowered the shotgun and slumped against the wall, suddenly weak as adrenaline drained away. His cabin was shot full of holes. He'd killed 2 men, maybe 3. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the gun. And he had no idea how salvation had arrived just in time to save his life. But it had. Against all probability, against all logic, help had come when he'd needed it most. The dogs were beside him now, pressing against his legs, offering comfort and seeking reassurance. He dropped to his knees and pulled them close, burying his face in their thick fur, feeling their solid warmth and steady heartbeats. "We made it," he whispered. "We actually made it." Outside, the cavalry was dismounting in his clearing, officers giving orders, troopers securing the area and checking the bodies in the snow. Someone was approaching his door with purpose and authority. Elias stood on shaking legs, still holding the shotgun, but pointed down now, non-threatening. He opened what was left of his door and stepped out into the twilight. The officer who faced him was young, maybe 30, with lieutenant's bars on his coat and intelligence in his eyes. He looked at Elias, at the shot-up cabin, at the bodies in the snow, and his expression shifted to something like respect. "Mr. Thorne?" the lieutenant asked. "That's right. How did you know you were in trouble?" "We didn't. Not exactly." The lieutenant glanced past Elias at the dogs who'd followed him outside. "We've been tracking those stolen dogs for 3 days. Lost the trail in the storm last night, but our tracker managed to pick it up again this morning. Led us straight here." The lieutenant stepped closer, his eyes on Scout and Keeper. "Those are U.S. Army property, Mr. Thorne. Stolen from Fort Benton 2 weeks ago, along with 60 cavalry horses. We've been searching for them, and the men who took them, ever since." Elias looked down at the dogs, at their intelligent eyes and loyal faces, and understanding bloomed. They hadn't just been running from Kane when they'd stumbled to his cabin. They'd been running towards safety, and somehow, in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, they'd led the cavalry straight to him. "They saved my life," he said quietly. "Saved it twice." The lieutenant nodded. "And you saved theirs. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually." He paused, looking around at the evidence of recent battle. "We're going to need your statement about what happened here, about the men who attacked you, where they went, what they told you, any information that might help us track them down." "They're running," Elias said, "headed for the high passes with 60 stolen horses. They've got a 3-day window before weather closes the route. You move fast, you might catch them." The lieutenant's eyes sharpened. "You know where they're going." "I know enough." "And Lieutenant, their leader's name is Garrett Kane. He's killed before, and he won't hesitate to kill again. You go after him. You go ready for a fight." "We will." The lieutenant turned to his men, already barking orders about pursuit and tracking. Then he looked back at Elias. "You did good here, Mr. Thorne, standing up to those men, protecting army property when you didn't have to. The army appreciates it. I appreciate it." Elias just nodded, too tired for words. The dogs pressed against his legs, and he let himself lean on them slightly, drawing strength from their solid presence. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting everything in gold and shadow. His cabin was ruined. He'd killed men today. He'd come within minutes of dying himself. But he was alive. The dogs were safe. And sometimes that was victory enough. The cavalry made camp in Elias's clearing as darkness fell completely, their fires bright points against the mountain night. Troopers moved with practiced efficiency, setting up picket lines for horses, establishing guard rotations, preparing for an early departure. The lieutenant, his name was Merrick, Elias learned, had sent half his men after Kane's trail immediately, unwilling to let the outlaws gain more distance. The rest would follow at first light, once they'd gathered intelligence from Elias and tended to the dead. Elias sat by his fire while a young trooper with medical training examined him for injuries. Cuts from flying splinters, bruises from thrown furniture, powder burns on his hands. Nothing serious. Nothing that wouldn't heal. The trooper wrapped his hands in clean bandages and off on his hands. Nothing serious. Nothing that wouldn't heal. The trooper wrapped his hands in clean bandages and offered him coffee from the army's supply. Real coffee, strong and hot, better than the bitter brew Elias made from his carefully rationed stores. "You're lucky," the trooper said, packing away his medical kit. "I've seen what happens when civilians tangle with men like Kane. Usually doesn't end with the civilian walking away." Elias sipped the coffee and didn't respond. Luck was one word for it. Grace was another. Sheer, stubborn foolishness was a third. He'd stood his ground against overwhelming force, and only the cavalry's arrival had saved him from being killed or worse. That wasn't tactical genius. That was gambling with his life and winning on the last card. Lieutenant Merrick came in after the trooper left, removing his hat and glancing around the shot-up cabin with professional assessment. "This is good construction," he said. "Solid logs, tight corners. Probably what kept you alive. Bullets had to work through thick wood instead of thin walls." "Built it myself," Elias said. "Took 2 summers. Well, it served you well today." Merrick sat down in the other chair, uninvited but not unwelcome. "I need to ask you some questions, if you're up for it. Details about the attack, about the men, about anything they might have said that could help us track them." Elias nodded and told the story from the beginning. Finding the dogs in the storm, the morning confrontation with Kane and his men, Pike's offer and warning, the assault at sunset. He left nothing out, describing every detail he could remember: numbers, weapons, tactics, the way they'd moved with military precision. Merrick listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather journal. When Elias mentioned the 60 stolen horses and the 3-day weather window, the lieutenant's expression hardened. "That matches our intelligence," Merrick said. "Fort Benton reported the horses missing 2 weeks ago. 60 head, including some of our best cavalry mounts." Someone had inside information, knew the patrol schedule, knew when the corral would be least guarded. It was a professional operation from start to finish. Kane mentioned selling them in Canada, Elias said. $20,000. Merrick's jaw tightened. There's a market across the border for stolen American horses. The Canadians don't ask questions if the price is right, and our jurisdiction ends at the border. Once Kane gets those horses across, we'll never see them again. He paused. But he can't move them without those dogs. 60 horses through mountain passes in winter requires serious control. Without trained herding dogs, the herd would scatter. Elias looked at Scout and Keeper, who'd settled by the fire after the cavalry arrived. They seemed calmer now, as if recognizing the soldiers as allies or at least not threats. How did they train dogs for that kind of work? Army program started 5 years ago, Merrick explained. We breed and train Australian shepherds specifically for cavalry support, moving large numbers of horses quickly, controlling them in difficult terrain, responding to mounted handlers. These two, he gestured at the dogs, are from our best bloodline. Took 3 years to train them to this level. They're worth more than most horses in terms of the investment we've put into their training. Worth killing for, Elias said quietly. Worth killing for, Merrick agreed. Kane knew exactly what he was stealing when he took them. Someone gave him specific intelligence about our most valuable assets. That suggested an inside man, Elias realized. Someone at Fort Benton had fed Kane information, helped plan the theft, maybe even facilitated the actual stealing. This wasn't just about catching a gang of horse thieves. This was about rooting out betrayal within the army's own ranks. You think Pike might talk? Elias asked. The young one who came under the white flag, he searched for the right word, uncomfortable with killing, like he still had conscience left. Caleb Pike. Merrick's expression suggested he knew the name. He's got a reputation. Former ranch hand from Miles City, fell in with Kane about a year ago. Not a hardened criminal yet, but getting there. If we can catch him separate from Kane, maybe we can flip him. Get him to testify in exchange for leniency. He warned me, Elias said. Told me Kane would kill me without hesitation, said he didn't want to be part of killing a good man. That took courage, even if he wasn't brave enough to walk away. Merrick made a note. That's useful. Shows he might be persuadable. He looked up from his journal. Mr. Thorne, I need to ask you something. When we catch these men, and we will catch them, would you be willing to testify? Identify them in court, tell a judge and jury what happened here. Elias hesitated. Testifying meant coming down from the mountain, entering civilization again, facing people and questions and all the things he'd been avoiding for 5 years. It meant being visible when he'd worked hard to become invisible. But it also meant justice. It meant Kane and his men facing consequences for their crimes. It meant the inside man at Fort Benton being exposed and punished. It meant standing up, not just for 2 dogs, but for the rule of law itself. I'll testify, he said. Merrick nodded, satisfied. Thank you. Your testimony will be crucial. You're the only civilian witness who can place Kane at the scene, who can describe the assault, who can corroborate the stolen property. He stood, preparing to leave. We'll be heading out at first light, following Kane's trail. I'm leaving 2 men here with you, partly for your protection in case any of Kane's gang circles back, partly because you'll need help repairing this cabin. I can manage alone, Elias said automatically. I'm sure you can, but the army owes you a debt for protecting our property and standing up to criminals when you had no obligation to do so. Let us help. Let us show appreciation for what you did today. After Merrick left, Elias sat alone with his thoughts and the dogs. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the murmur of voices from the cavalry camp outside. He felt hollowed out, exhausted not just physically but emotionally. He'd killed 2 men today. Maybe 3, he wasn't sure if the first man he'd shot had died or just been wounded. Either way, he'd taken lives, and that weight would stay with him. But he'd also saved lives. The dogs' lives, certainly, and maybe the lives of other civilians or soldiers who would have suffered if Kane had completed his operation successfully. That had to count for something. That had to balance the scales at least a little. Scout moved closer, resting his head on Elias's knee. The gesture was simple and trusting, and it broke something inside Elias that had been locked tight for 5 years. He reached down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the soft fur and solid skull, the living warmth of another creature who'd chosen to offer comfort. "You're a good dog," he said quietly. "You're both good dogs." Keeper joined them, pressing against his other leg, and for a moment Elias was surrounded by simple animal affection with no complications or demands, just presence, just companionship, just the basic acknowledgement that he existed and mattered. The ring around his neck felt heavier than usual. Sarah had been dead 5 years. He'd mourned her for 5 years. He'd hidden from life for 5 years. And in one day, 2 dogs and a gang of outlaws had pulled him back into the world, whether he wanted it or not. Maybe that was good, maybe it was time. Outside, the cavalry fires burned bright against the darkness. Inside, Elias Thorne sat with 2 dogs who'd changed his life, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The night was cold and the future was uncertain, but he was alive, and that was something, that was enough. For now. The next morning came grey and cold, with clouds building to the west that promised more snow within a day or 2. The cavalry broke camp efficiently, leaving 2 troopers as promised, Corporals Henderson and Chen, both young and capable-looking. Merrick shook Elias's hand before mounting up, his grip firm and respectful. "We'll send word when we've caught them," the lieutenant said. "Might be a few days, might be longer. They've got a head start, but we've got better horses, and we know these mountains. We'll run them down." Elias watched the cavalry ride out, their column disappearing into the tree line with military precision. Then it was just him, 2 troopers, and 2 dogs in a clearing that still bore evidence of yesterday's violence, blood in the snow, bullet holes in the cabin, the memory of gunfire and desperation. The corporals set to work helping him patch the worst of the damage, nailing boards over broken windows, reinforcing the door, sweeping up shattered glass and splintered wood. They worked quietly and efficiently, and Elias appreciated their competence. By midday, the cabin was functional again, if not pretty. Weatherproof at least. Safe enough. "Thank you," Elias said when the work was done. "For the help." "Our pleasure, sir," Henderson replied. "The lieutenant said you stood alone against 10 men. That's the kind of courage the army respects." Courage? Elias wasn't sure about that. It had felt more like stubbornness, or maybe just the inability to live with himself if he'd surrendered. But he accepted the compliment with a nod and offered them coffee as payment for their labor. The afternoon passed quietly. The troopers kept watch in shifts, scanning the tree line for any sign of Kane's men doubling back. Elias tended to the dogs, checking them over carefully for any injuries he might have missed in the chaos. They were fine, just tired from the stress and excitement. Good dogs, brave dogs, dogs who'd earned their rest. That night, as the 3 men sat around the fire sharing a simple meal, Henderson asked the question Elias had been expecting. "You really live up here alone, year round?" "For 15 years, Elias confirmed. "Don't you get lonely?" Elias looked at the dogs, sleeping peacefully by the fire. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I had reasons for coming up here." "Good reasons." Chen, who'd been quiet most of the day, spoke up. "Sometimes running away is the same as running towards something. Took me a while to figure that out." It was a wise observation from a young man, and Elias found himself nodding. Maybe that was true. Maybe he'd been running toward something all along, toward peace, toward simplicity, toward a life where nothing could hurt him because nothing mattered enough to cause pain. But today had proven that was impossible. Pain found you anyway, choices found you anyway, connection found you anyway, whether you wanted it or not. Maybe it was time to stop running. The thought scared him more than facing Kane's guns had, but it also felt right, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like something was shifting inside him, some frozen thing beginning to thaw. Tomorrow the cavalry would return, hopefully with prisoners. Tomorrow he'd have to decide what came next. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out if he could walk back down that mountain, back into the world, back into a life that included other people and all the complications that came with them. But that was tomorrow. Tonight he had a warm fire, a patched cabin, 2 good dogs, and 2 decent young soldiers keeping watch. Tonight he was alive and safe, and not alone. For a man who'd spent 5 years in isolation, that felt like something close to abundance. He touched Sarah's ring one more time, then let it rest against his chest. She'd want him to live, not just survive. She'd want him to move forward, not just exist. Maybe it was time to honor that wish. Maybe it was time to try. 3 days passed in relative peace. The corporals kept watch, Elias repaired more damage to the cabin, and the dogs settled into a comfortable routine that suggested they were in no hurry to leave. The weather held cold but clear, perfect conditions for the cavalry's pursuit. Merrick had sent no word, which could mean anything: successful tracking that kept them moving, or trouble that prevented communication. On the afternoon of the 4th day, riders approached from the valley. Elias heard them before he saw them, the jingle of tack, the muffled sound of hooves in snow. He grabbed his Winchester out of habit, though the corporals had already moved to defensive positions with practiced ease. But it was Merrick returning, and the expression on his face told Elias immediately that something had gone wrong. The lieutenant dismounted heavily, his uniform dusty and worn, his eyes carrying the weight of bad news. Behind him, his reduced patrol looked equally exhausted. Elias counted quickly. They'd left with 6 men. Only 4 had returned. "We found them," Merrick said without preamble. "Caught up to them at 3 Forks Pass, about 40 miles north. They'd made camp, were preparing to move the horses through at first light." He paused, his jaw working. "It went bad, Mr. Thorne. Real bad." Elias poured coffee for the lieutenant, waiting for him to continue. The man needed a moment to compose himself, to find words for whatever he'd seen. "They were ready for us," Merrick finally said. "Had sentries posted, had defensive positions prepared. We tried to parley, tried to get them to surrender peacefully. Kane shot our negotiator before he got within 20 yards. Then they opened fire, and it became a running battle through the rocks. The 2 men you lost," Elias said quietly. "Private Morrison and Sergeant Blake. Good men, both of them. Blake had been cavalry for 12 years, had a wife and 3 children in Miles City." Merrick's voice was steady, but his eyes were haunted. "We killed 3 of Kane's men and wounded 2 others. But Kane himself got away, along with Pike and 2 others. They scattered into different directions, and we didn't have the numbers to pursue all of them. That was bad, but not catastrophic. The gang was broken up, the operation disrupted. Even without catching Kane personally, the mission had succeeded in stopping the horse theft." But Merrick's expression suggested there was more to the story. "We recovered the horses," the lieutenant continued. "All 60 head, exactly as Kane claimed. They're being driven back to Fort Benton now, under heavy guard." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn and water-stained. "But we found this in Kane's saddlebags, and Mr. Thorne, this changes everything." Elias took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in careful script, dated 3 weeks earlier. His eyes scanned the words, and with each line, his understanding of the situation shifted. The letter was addressed to Kane from someone at Fort Benton, providing detailed information about patrol schedules, guard rotations, and the location of the Army's most valuable horses and dogs. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the signature at the bottom. Captain James Thornton, Fort Benton Quartermaster. And below that, in smaller writing, "Once the operation is complete and the horses are sold, my share is 40% as agreed. The dogs must be eliminated after use. They can identify me as their previous handler. No witnesses, no evidence." Elias read the letter twice, absorbing the implications. The inside man wasn't some corrupt enlisted soldier or junior officer. It was the quartermaster himself, a captain with direct access to all the fort's resources and information. And he'd planned not just the theft, but the murder of the dogs who could link him to the crime. Thornton, Merrick said, his voice tight with controlled fury, was Blake's brother-in-law. Blake trusted him completely. We all did. He's been at Fort Benton for 6 years, with an exemplary record. He was being considered for promotion to major. He looked at Elias with something like anguish in his eyes, and the whole time he was planning this. Using his position to steal from the army he swore to serve, getting good soldiers killed to cover his crimes. "Does he know you have the letter?" Elias asked. "No. We sent a rider back to the fort with orders to keep Thornton under surveillance, but not to arrest him yet. We need to handle this carefully. A captain being arrested for treason will shake the entire fort, maybe the entire territory. We need evidence beyond just the letter. Need to make sure the case is solid before we move." Elias looked at the dogs, understanding finally why Kane had been so desperate to get them back. It wasn't just about controlling the horses, it was about eliminating witnesses. Scout and Keeper had been Thornton's dogs before being stolen. They knew him, would recognize him, would respond to his commands. In a court, that kind of testimony, even from animals, could be damning. "So Kane is still out there," Elias said, "knowing that you have the letter, knowing that his operation is blown. What does he do now?" "That's what worries me." Merrick stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Kane's a survivor. He spent 20 years staying one step ahead of the law, adapting to setbacks, finding new angles. He won't just run and hide. He'll try to salvage something from this disaster." "The dogs," Elias said. Understanding, dawning. "He'll come back for the dogs. Not just for the dogs, for revenge. You humiliated him, Mr. Thorne. You held him off when you should have died. You cost him his operation, his men, his money. Men like Kane don't forgive that. They can't afford to. It makes them look weak." Chen spoke up from his position by the door. "Sir, if Kane's coming back, we need reinforcements. We've only got 4 men, and Kane still has Pike and at least 2 others with him." "Reinforcements are on the way," Merrick said. "Should be here by tomorrow night, but until then, we need to be ready for anything." He turned to Elias. "I'm sorry to ask this, but we need you to be ready too. Your rifle, your knowledge of this terrain, it could make the difference." Elias nodded slowly. He'd known, somehow, that this wasn't over. Kane wasn't the type to let loose ends dangle. The man was a professional, and professionals finished what they started. "There's something else," Merrick said, his voice dropping. "Pike sent word. He wants to surrender, wants to testify against both Kane and Thornton in exchange for leniency. He says he has information we need, information that could prevent something he called the contingency plan. But he won't come in while Kane's still free. He's too scared." "What contingency plan?" Elias asked. "That's what we need to find out." Pike wouldn't say more, just that Kane always has a backup, always has another move. And whatever it is, Pike thinks it's bad enough that he's willing to risk betraying his boss to stop it. The cabin fell silent as everyone absorbed this new information. Outside, snow began to fall again, light flakes that would pile up quickly in the cold night air. The weather window was closing, just as Kane had feared. But the operation was over, the horses were recovered, and the inside man was identified. So what was Kane's backup plan? Elias thought back to his confrontation with the outlaw leader, remembering the cold intelligence in those grey eyes, the way Kane had assessed every situation for advantage. A man like that wouldn't put all his eggs in one basket. He'd have alternatives, fallbacks, contingencies. "The letter mentioned 40% going to Thornton," Elias said slowly, working through the logic. $20,000 total means Thornton's share would be $8,000. That leaves $12,000 for Kane and his men. But Kane had 10 men originally. Split 10 ways. That's barely $1,200 each. Not nearly enough money to justify the risk of a federal crime and possible hanging. Merrick caught his drift immediately. You think the horses weren't the real score, they were just part of something bigger. Or a distraction, Elias said. Think about it. Thornton provides information about horses and dogs, helps Kane steal them, draws all the cavalry's attention to a big, obvious crime that requires immediate pursuit. While everyone's chasing Kane through the mountains, Thornton has access to whatever the real target is. Merrick finished. My God, the horses were bait. The whole operation was designed to pull security away from the fort, create chaos and confusion, give Thornton an opportunity to steal something much more valuable. What's at Fort Benton that's worth more than 60 cavalry horses? Elias asked. Merrick's face went pale. The payroll. We received the quarterly payroll 3 days ago, $30,000 in gold and silver coin, secured in the quartermaster's vault, Thornton's vault, under his control. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. While the cavalry had been chasing Kane and the horses, Thornton had probably been emptying the payroll vault. $30,000, real wealth, enough to disappear forever, enough to make elaborate planning and desperate risks worthwhile. The letter said, no witnesses, no evidence, Elias said. What if that applies to more than just the dogs? What if Kane's contingency plan is to eliminate everyone who knows about Thornton's involvement? Pike, Chen said. Pike knows everything. That's why he wants to surrender but is too scared to come in. He knows Kane will kill him to protect Thornton. And us, Henderson added grimly. We found the letter. We know about Thornton. If Kane's being paid to eliminate witnesses, then we're all targets, Merrick finished. Kane's not just coming for the dogs, he's coming to kill everyone who can connect him to Thornton. Everyone who can testify about the larger conspiracy. Elias looked at the 4 cavalrymen, seeing the same realization dawn in their eyes. They weren't just defending against a revenge attack. They were defending against an assassination mission designed to protect a treasonous officer and secure $30,000 in stolen payroll. How long until reinforcements arrive? Elias asked. 24 hours, maybe more if the weather turns bad. And Kane knows we're here, knows we found the letter, knows we can connect him to Thornton. Elias stood and picked up his Winchester. He won't wait for reinforcements. He'll come tonight, while the odds are still manageable. 4 soldiers and 1 civilian against 4 desperate men with nothing to lose. 5. Scout stood and moved to Elias's side, alert and ready. Keeper followed, both dogs sensing the tension in the room. 5 and 2 dogs who won't let anyone hurt their people. Merrick smiled without humor. Then we'd better prepare for a long night, gentlemen, because Garrett Kane is coming, and this time it won't be about capturing dogs. It'll be about silencing witnesses permanently. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering tracks and muffling sounds. Perfect conditions for an approach, perfect conditions for an attack. The sun was setting again, painting the snow red and orange, blood and fire colors. Again, Elias checked his rifle and took his position by the window. The dogs flanked him, loyal and brave. The soldiers prepared their defenses with grim determination. And somewhere in the darkening forest, Garrett Kane and his remaining men were coming closer, carrying death and desperation in equal measure. The real fight was about to begin. And this time, the cavalry couldn't save them. They'd have to save themselves. The preparations took on new urgency with the understanding of what they faced. This wasn't a gang trying to steal back valuable property. This was an execution squad coming to eliminate witnesses to treason and murder. Kane would be ruthless, efficient, and utterly committed to leaving no survivors. Merrick took command with the calm authority of an officer who'd faced death before and made peace with it. He positioned his men strategically, Henderson at the back window, covering the upslope approach. Chen at the side window, watching the tree line where Kane had camped before. Merrick himself took the front with Elias, where the primary assault would likely come. Corporal Davis, who'd returned with the lieutenant, was positioned inside to plug holes, reinforce weak points, and provide supporting fire wherever needed. 4 men against 4, Merrick said, checking his rifle's action. Even odds if you don't count experience and desperation. Kane's men have both advantages. 5 against 4, Elias corrected. I've killed before. I can do it again if I have to. I know. That's why we're still alive. Merrick smiled grimly. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Thorne. When they come, and they will come, it's not going to be like the first attack. Last time they wanted the dogs intact, wanted to capture them safely. This time they just want us dead. They'll use fire, explosives if they have them, anything to end this quickly. Fire. Elias hadn't considered that. The cabin was wood, and despite the recent snow, the inside was dry as kindling. One well-placed torch, and they'd be forced outside into the open, where Kane's men would cut them down easily. We need to wet down the exterior walls, Elias said, make them harder to burn. Chen and Henderson spent the next hour hauling snow and melting it, then using rags to soak the cabin's exterior. It wouldn't stop a determined fire attack, but it might buy them precious minutes. Minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. While they worked, Elias took stock of their ammunition situation. It wasn't good. Between the 5 of them, they had perhaps 80 rounds total. Enough for a sustained fight, but not enough to hold off a siege. They'd have to make every shot count. Conserve ammunition, pick their targets carefully. The dogs stayed close to Elias, watching the preparations with intelligent eyes. They understood danger was coming. Scout kept moving to the door, growling low, then returning to Elias's side. The behavior was consistent. He was warning of approach, but not seeing immediate threat yet, like he could sense men moving in the distance, getting closer but not yet in range. Your dog's got good instincts, Merrick observed. Military training teaches them to alert on hostile movement from considerable distance. Scouts telling us they're out there, maybe half a mile away, working their way closer. Elias trusted Scout's instincts more than his own eyes in the gathering darkness. The dog had been trained for this kind of work, had skills that exceeded human senses. If, Scout said, enemies were approaching. Full darkness came at last, bringing with it the peculiar silence of fresh snowfall. The world was muffled, sounds absorbed by the heavy flakes, visibility reduced to whatever the firelight could illuminate. Perfect conditions for an attack, perfect conditions for desperate men to make their move. Elias found himself thinking about Sarah again, about the choices that had led him to this moment. If he'd stayed in the valley, kept the ranch, remained part of civilization, he wouldn't be here. He'd be safe in some warm house, mourning his wife but alive and secure. Instead, he'd run to the mountains seeking isolation, and isolation had delivered him straight into mortal danger. But isolation had also given him purpose. He'd saved 2 innocent animals. He'd stood up to criminals when he could have looked away. He'd helped expose corruption that went straight to the Army's officer corps. These weren't small things. These were things that mattered. Sarah would have been proud, scared for him certainly, but proud underneath the fear. The ring around his neck felt warm, like it always did when he thought of her. A reminder that love persisted beyond death, that commitment meant something even when the person you'd committed to was gone. He'd committed to her, and to the values they'd shared. Tonight would test whether that commitment was just words or something deeper. Around 9 o'clock, Scout's behavior changed. He went rigid, ears forward, hackles raised. A deep growl rumbled from his chest, sustained and warning. Keeper joined him, both dogs focused on the front of the cabin with absolute intensity. "They're here," Merrick said quietly. "Everyone to positions. Conserve ammunition. Shoot only when you have clear targets. And remember, we just need to survive until dawn. Reinforcements are coming. We hold until then, we win." Dawn was 9 hours away. 9 hours might as well have been 9 years. Elias settled behind the overturned table, his Winchester braced and ready. His hands weren't shaking this time. Fear was still there, coiling in his chest like a snake, but it was familiar now. He'd faced it before and survived. He could do it again. The first sound was a whistle, high and mocking, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. A signal, or maybe just psychological warfare, letting them know the attackers were out there, were ready, were coming. Then silence, long, stretching silence that played on nerves and imagination. Elias could feel sweat on his palms despite the cold. The waiting was almost worse than the fighting. This anticipation of violence that could come from any direction at any moment. Chen called out from the side window. "Movement, tree line, 2 figures. Hold fire," Merrick ordered. "Let them commit. Let them get close enough that we can't miss." The waiting continued. Elias could hear his own breathing, loud in his ears. Could hear the dogs panting softly, their body heat warming his legs where they pressed against him. Could hear the fire crackling and wood settling, and his own heart hammering against his ribs. Then everything happened at once. The front window exploded inward, not from gunfire, but from something heavy thrown through it. A burning bundle, rags soaked in oil wrapped around a rock, flames already spreading to the wooden floor where it landed. Chen and Henderson both fired from their positions, their rifles barking in the enclosed space. Shouts from outside, men scattering for cover. Davis rushed to the burning bundle with a bucket of melted snow, dousing the flames before they could spread. Smoke filled the cabin, acrid and choking. More gunfire from outside, bullets punching through walls, through windows, through the door. The attack had begun in earnest, and it was chaos from the first second. Elias saw muzzle flashes in the darkness and fired at them, levered another round, fired again. Someone screamed, hit, or just startled, he couldn't tell. Beside him, Merrick was firing with methodical precision, not rushing, taking time to aim despite the chaos. Another burning bundle came through the broken window, then another through the side window where Chen was positioned. Davis and Henderson scrambled to extinguish them, but the smoke was getting worse, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. "They're trying to smoke us out," Merrick shouted over the gunfire. "Everyone, wet cloths over your faces. Don't let them force us outside." Elias grabbed a rag, dunked it in the water bucket, tied it around his nose and mouth. It helped, but not much. The smoke was winning, filling the cabin, making his eyes water and his throat burn. Through the haze, he saw movement at the side window. A man climbing through, taking advantage of the chaos. Chen was occupied with a fire, Henderson helping him, Davis reloading. The intruder would be inside in seconds. But Scout saw him too. The dog launched himself at the window with a snarl that was purely feral, all teeth and fury. He caught the man's arm as it came through, his jaws clamping down with crushing force. The man screamed and fell backward, disappearing into the darkness. "Good dog," Elias shouted, then returned fire through the front window. 2 more muzzle flashes, 2 more shots. His rifle clicked empty, and he grabbed the shotgun, holding it ready for close work. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Burning bundles kept coming, requiring constant attention to prevent the cabin from catching fire. Bullets kept coming, requiring constant ducking and defensive shooting. The smoke got worse and worse, until Elias could barely see Merrick 3 feet away. "We can't stay here," Chen called out, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Another few minutes and we'll suffocate." "Hold position," Merrick ordered. "They want us outside where they can pick us off. We hold." But holding was becoming impossible. The smoke was too thick, the heat from multiple small fires too intense. Elias's lungs burned with every breath. His eyes streamed tears. The dogs were coughing, pressing close to the floor where the air was slightly clearer. Then, cutting through the chaos, came a new voice. Young, desperate, terrified. "Stop! Stop shooting! I'm coming in! Don't shoot!" "Pike!" It was Pike's voice, coming from the direction of the tree line. "It's a trick," Henderson shouted. "Has to be." "Wait," Pike called again. "I've got information. Kane's planning. A single shot rang out from somewhere in the darkness. Pike's voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a choking gasp. Then silence. Through the smoke and darkness, Elias heard Kane's voice, cold and matter-of-fact. "Traitors dealt with. Now burn them out. I want this finished." More gunfire. More burning bundles. The assault intensified, coordinated, and relentless. Kane had killed his own man to prevent him from talking, and now he was committed to total violence. No mercy. No quarter. Just death. Elias fired the shotgun blindly through the smoke, heard the satisfying sound of someone taking cover. Beside him, Merrick was bleeding from a cut above his eye, where a bullet had grazed him, but he kept shooting with mechanical precision. The cabin was dying around them, filling with smoke and fire despite their best efforts. They were being cooked alive, forced into an impossible choice: stay and suffocate, or flee and be shot down. "We need a new plan," Elias coughed out. "We need it now." "I'm open to suggestions," Merrick replied, reloading with shaking hands. Elias looked at the dogs, at Scout and Keeper, who'd stayed loyal through everything, who'd trusted him to protect them. An idea formed, desperate and probably suicidal, but better than waiting to die from smoke inhalation. "The back window," he said. "The upslope approach. They won't expect us to go that way because it's exposed, difficult terrain." "That's because it's a death trap," Henderson pointed out. "Steep slope, no cover, they'll cut us down before we get 50 feet. "Not if they're focused on the cabin," Elias said. "Not if they think we're still inside." Merrick caught his meaning immediately. A diversion. Someone stays, keeps firing, makes them think we're all still fighting. The others slip out the back, circle around, hit them from behind. "I'll stay," Elias said. "It's my cabin. I know every board, every position. I can hold them off longest." "No," Merrick said firmly. "You're civilian. I won't order you to sacrifice yourself. I'll stay. The rest of you go." "Sir," Chen started to protest. "That's an order, Corporal. Take Henderson and Davis. Take Mr. Thorne. Take the dogs. Circle around, hit them from their flank. I'll give you 10 minutes, then make my own run for it." It was a suicide mission dressed up as strategy, and they all knew it. Whoever stayed would probably die, buying time for the others to escape and counterattack. It was the kind of decision officers were trained to make, the kind of sacrifice leadership sometimes demanded. Elias started to argue, but Merrick cut him off with a look. "You saved those dogs when you could have let them die. You stood against criminals when you could have looked away. You've done enough, Mr. Thorne. Let me do my job. Let me protect my men." There was no time for more debate. The smoke was too thick, the fire spreading too fast. They had maybe minutes before the cabin became untenable, even with someone staying to fight. "Go," Merrick said. "Go now, and make my stand worth something. Stop Kane, stop Thornton, make sure their crimes don't go unpunished." Elias grabbed Scout's collar, Henderson grabbed Keeper's, and they moved toward the back window. Chen went first, slipping through and immediately scrambling up the steep slope in the darkness. Davis followed, then Henderson with Keeper. Elias paused at the window, looking back at Merrick, who'd already returned to the front, firing methodically into the darkness, making sure Kane's men stayed focused on the cabin. "Thank you," Elias said, knowing the words were inadequate, but having nothing better. Merrick didn't turn around. "Just finish it. That's all the thanks I need." Then Elias was through the window, Scout beside him, climbing the steep slope with legs that felt like lead. Behind him, the cabin continued to burn, and Merrick continued to fight, 1 man against 4, buying time with his life. The snow was deep and the slope was treacherous, but Elias climbed with desperate strength, knowing that every second mattered, knowing that Merrick's sacrifice had to mean something. At the top of the slope, he paused and looked back. The cabin was fully visible from here, lit by flames and muzzle flashes, a small fortress making its last stand against overwhelming force. Inside, Lieutenant Merrick was fighting alone, holding the line, giving his men and one stubborn civilian time to circle around and turn the tide. It was the most courageous thing Elias had ever witnessed, and he would make sure it wasn't in vain. The climb took 5 brutal minutes that felt like 50. The slope was steep and slick with fresh snow, every step a gamble between progress and sliding back down. Elias's lungs burned from smoke and exertion, his legs shaking from effort and fear. Scout stayed close, his 4-legged traction giving him advantage on the treacherous slope. At the crest, they regrouped in the shelter of a rock outcropping: Chen, Henderson, Davis, Elias, and 2 dogs. 4 men and 2 animals against 4 killers who'd already murdered Pike and were trying to murder Merrick. The odds weren't good, but they were better than they'd been 10 minutes ago. From this elevation, Elias could see the tactical situation clearly. Kane's men were spread in a loose arc around the cabin's front and sides, focused entirely on maintaining their assault. The burning cabin lit them intermittently, revealing positions and movements. They thought they were winning, thought they had their targets trapped and helpless. They were about to learn otherwise. "Chen, Henderson, you take the left flank," Chen whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. "Davis and Mr. Thorne, we've got the right. Hit them simultaneously on my signal. Aim for center mass, shoot to kill. These men murdered our brothers. They get no mercy." It was the kind of cold, tactical thinking that kept soldiers alive. Elias nodded, checking his Winchester one more time. 4 rounds left, plus the shotgun if things got close, plus Scout, who'd proven he could fight when needed. They moved carefully down the slope, using the darkness and terrain for cover, circling wide to get behind Kane's positions. The snow helped, muffling their footsteps, but it also slowed them down. Every second mattered. Merrick couldn't hold forever. From the cabin came sustained gunfire. Merrick was still fighting, still alive, still giving them the time they needed. The man was a warrior in the truest sense, holding impossible ground against impossible odds. Elias and Davis reached their position behind a fallen log, perhaps 30 yards from Kane's right flank. 2 men were visible there, both focused on the cabin, both exposed and vulnerable. Across the clearing, he could barely make out Chen and Henderson moving into their own positions. Chen's signal came a low whistle, the same mocking sound Kane had used earlier. Poetic justice. 4 rifles spoke almost simultaneously. Kane's right flank man went down immediately, Henderson's shot catching him in the back. The second man spun toward the new threat, but caught Davis's bullet in the chest before he could bring his weapon to bear. On the left flank, Chen's target stumbled but didn't fall, returning fire wildly into the darkness. Henderson's follow-up shot finished him. That left Kane himself, and Kane was a survivor. He'd already abandoned his position and was running for the tree line, moving fast despite the snow, using every bit of cover available. Chen and Henderson fired at him, but the darkness and distance made for difficult shooting. Elias tracked him with his Winchester, leading the movement, accounting for range and speed. He breathed out slowly, squeezed the trigger, and watched Kane stumble. Hit, but not down. The man recovered and kept running, favoring his left side where Elias's bullet had found him. "After him!" Chen shouted, and they all surged forward. But Kane had reached the tree line and disappeared into the forest's darkness. Pursuing him into unknown terrain in the dark would be suicide. "Let him go," Davis said. "We got 3 of his men. He's wounded. He won't get far." "The lieutenant," Henderson said urgently, already moving toward the cabin. "We need to get to the lieutenant." They reached the cabin at a run. It was burning in earnest now, flames licking up the walls, smoke pouring from every opening. The gunfire from inside had stopped. "Lieutenant," Chen called out. "Lieutenant Merrick." No response. Elias pushed past them and kicked in what remained of the door. Heat and smoke hit him like a physical blow, driving him back. Scout tried to follow him inside, but Elias grabbed his collar and held him back. "Stay. Stay here." He took a breath of clean air, held it, and pushed into the inferno. The interior was hellish, flames everywhere, smoke so thick he couldn't see 3 feet ahead. He dropped to his hands and knees where the air was slightly better and crawled forward, calling Merrick's name, feeling blindly through the smoke and heat. His hand found fabric, then a body. Merrick collapsed behind the overturned table, his rifle still clutched in his hands. Elias grabbed the lieutenant under the arms and dragged him toward where he thought the door was. His lungs screamed for air, his eyes burned, his skin felt like it was blistering from the heat. Then hands were grabbing him, pulling him outside, pulling Merrick outside. They all collapsed in the snow 20 feet from the cabin, coughing and gasping, watching as the structure that had been Elias's home for 15 years burned down to its foundation. Davis was checking Merrick, feeling for a pulse, for breath, for any sign of life. "He's alive," Davis said, his voice breaking with relief. "Barely, but he's alive. Smoke inhalation, maybe some burns. He needs a doctor." Merrick coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering open. "Did you," he gasped, "get them?" "3 down, Chen reported. "Kane ran. He's wounded, won't get far in his condition." "Finish it," Merrick whispered. "Don't let him escape. Don't let Thornton." He started coughing again, harsh and wet. Davis supported him, talking softly, telling him to save his strength. Elias stood on shaking legs and looked at the burning cabin. Everything he owned was in there, turning to ash. His grandfather's tools, his books, the few mementos he'd kept from his life with Sarah, all of it gone. But he was alive. His men were alive. The dogs were safe, and Kane was wounded and running. The job wasn't finished. Not yet. "Chen, you and Henderson stay with Merrick and Davis," Elias said, his voice rough from smoke. "Keep him warm, keep him breathing. Reinforcements should be here by dawn." "Where are you going?" Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "To finish it." Elias reloaded his Winchester with the last of his ammunition. 3 rounds. It would have to be enough. Kane can't get far with a bullet in him, and he can't be allowed to reach Thornton, can't warn him that we're coming. "Sir, you're not military. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Elias looked at the burning cabin one more time, then at Scout, who sat alert and ready at his side. "Sometimes you have to see things through to the end. Sometimes running isn't an option." He started toward the tree line, following the blood trail Kane had left in the snow. Scout padded beside him, faithful to the last. Behind them, the cabin collapsed inward, with a shower of sparks that lit the night sky. Ahead, somewhere in the dark forest, a wounded and dangerous man was running for his life. And Elias Thorne, who'd spent 5 years running from his own pain, was done running. The blood trail was easy to follow in the fresh snow-dark drops that looked black in the moonlight, spaced irregularly where Kane had stumbled or slowed. Elias moved carefully, rifle ready, knowing that a wounded animal was often the most dangerous. Kane had nothing to lose now. His operation was destroyed, his men were dead, and he was bleeding out in the wilderness. A man in that position might do anything. Scout ranged ahead slightly, nose to the ground, following the scent with more reliability than Elias's eyes could manage in the darkness. The dog moved with purpose and confidence, pausing occasionally to ensure Elias was keeping up. They'd been tracking for perhaps 20 minutes when Scout stopped abruptly, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Elias dropped to one knee, scanning the forest ahead for movement or threat. "I know you're there." "Old man." Kane's voice came from behind a cluster of pines, rough with pain but still controlled. "Can hear you crunching through the snow like a buffalo. You and that damn dog both." "It's over, Kane," Elias called back. "Your men are dead. The cabin's burned. The cavalry knows about Thornton. Surrender, and you might live long enough to see a trial." Kane laughed, a wet, bubbling sound that suggested lung damage. "Trial? For what? Stealing horses? That's a hanging offense, old man. I got nothing to gain by surrendering and everything to lose. You're bleeding out. You won't make it through the night without medical help." Maybe not, but I'll make it long enough to put a bullet in you. And that dog, that'll have to be satisfaction enough. Elias could hear the wound in Cain's voice, the labored breathing, the pauses where pain stole words. The man was failing, but he was still dangerous, still armed, still capable of killing from ambush. "Why'd you do it?" Elias asked, trying to keep Cain talking, trying to locate his exact position. 20 years avoiding the law, and you risk it all for stolen horses and a corrupt quartermaster. Why? Money, Cain said simply. Always money. $30,000 buys a lot of forgetting. Buys a man a new life in a place where no one knows his name or cares about his past. He coughed, harsh and painful. But you ruined that, didn't you? You and your damn principles. Couldn't just hand over 2 dogs. Had to make it complicated. Those dogs saved my life. And cost me mine. Funny how that works. Another wet cough. You know what the irony is? I was going to retire after this job. Buy a ranch in Mexico, live quiet and peaceful. No more running, no more killing. Just me and the sun, and enough money to last until I died natural. You killed Pike, Elias said, moving slightly to his right, trying to flank Cain's position while keeping him talking. Scout moved with him, silent and low. Your own man. He was trying to surrender, trying to testify, and you shot him. Pike was weak. Got conscience when he should have had loyalty. Men like that get you killed, old man. Better to cut them loose before they drag you down with them. Elias caught movement, now a shape behind the pines, shifting position. Cain was trying to circle around too, both men hunting each other in the darkness. This would end soon, one way or another. Neither could afford to wait much longer. Thornton's finished, Elias said. The letter you carried, the one that proved he was behind everything. The cavalry has it. He'll hang for treason. Good. Hope I live long enough to hear about it. Cain's voice had moved. He was definitely circling, looking for advantage. Man betrayed his own country, his own men, for money. That's lower than anything I ever done. At least I was honest about being a criminal. Scout's body language changed, becoming more alert, more focused. He could smell Cain, could track him even in darkness. The dog's nose pointed left, toward a thick stand of spruce. That's where Cain was hiding, waiting for his shot. Elias moved right, putting a large pine between himself and Cain's position. Then he did something that felt insane, but was probably his best chance. He picked up a rock and threw it hard to his left, into the bushes 15 feet away. The sound brought instant response. Cain fired twice, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness, bullets smacking into snow and wood where he thought Elias was standing. But Elias was already moving, circling the pine, using the muzzle flashes to locate Cain's exact position. 3 more steps, and he'd have a clear shot. Cain saw him at the same moment. Both men brought rifles to shoulder simultaneously. For a frozen instant, they faced each other across 20 feet of snow-covered forest, both weapons aimed, both fingers on triggers. Should have let me have the dogs, Cain said. Couldn't do that, Elias replied. They fired together. Cain's bullet passed so close to Elias's head that he felt the air displacement, heard the snap as it went by. His own shot took Cain in the chest, punching through coat and flesh and bone with the finality of justice delivered. Cain staggered backward, his rifle falling from nerveless hands. He sat down hard in the snow, back against a tree, blood spreading dark across his coat. His breathing was labored, bubbling, failing. Elias approached carefully, rifle ready for any last desperate move. But Cain was done. His eyes were already glazing, focusing on something beyond the forest, beyond the snow, beyond this world. Funny thing, Cain whispered, blood on his lips. All that planning, all that killing, and I die because one stubborn old man wouldn't hand over 2 dogs. He coughed wetly. Tell me, old man, was it worth it? Losing your home, almost dying, all for animals you didn't even know? Elias looked at Scout, who sat alert and faithful beside him, thought about Keeper, safe with the soldiers, thought about Merrick, who'd held the line when it mattered most, thought about standing for something instead of running from everything. Yes, he said simply. It was worth it. Kane tried to laugh, but coughed instead. Then you're a fool. His eyes lost focus. But maybe a good kind of fool. His breathing stopped, his eyes fixed on nothing. Garrett Kane, outlaw and murderer, died in the snow without ceremony or mourning, as anonymous in death as he'd tried to be in life. Elias stood over the body for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. He'd killed 3 men in 2 days, 3 lives ended by his hand. That wasn't something that washed away with time or justification. It would stay with him, add to the burdens he already carried. But it had been necessary, it had been right, and sometimes that was all the peace a man could ask for. He turned and started walking back toward the clearing, toward the soldiers and the burning cabin and the long night that still needed to be survived. Scout walked beside him, loyal to the end. Behind them, Kane's body would freeze in the snow, undiscovered until spring if the wolves didn't find it first. No one would mourn him, no one would remember him kindly. But he'd been right about one thing. All his planning, all his killing, all his careful maneuvering had been undone by one stubborn old man who wouldn't compromise on principles. Sometimes stubbornness was the same as courage. Sometimes refusing to run was its own kind of strength. Elias had learned that lesson the hard way, but he'd learned it true. And that, he thought as the first hints of dawn began to pale the eastern sky, would have to be enough. The reinforcements arrived 2 hours after dawn, a full cavalry company with a surgeon and supply wagons. They found Merrick, alive but unconscious, the 3 surviving soldiers maintaining vigilance over the burned ruins of the cabin. And they found Elias sitting in the snow with 2 dogs, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The surgeon worked quickly, treating Merrick's smoke inhalation and burns with practiced efficiency. The lieutenant would recover, the surgeon declared, though he'd carry scars from the fire for the rest of his life. Physical scars, at least. The other kind would take longer to heal. Elias gave his statement to the cavalry captain who'd led the reinforcements, describing everything from Pike's murder to Kane's death in detail. The captain listened with grim satisfaction, making notes, asking clarifying questions. When Elias finished, the captain thanked him formally and said, "The army owed him a debt of gratitude." "About Captain Thornton," the captain said, "he's been arrested. When we went through the quartermaster's office, we found the vault empty, $30,000 gone, along with Thornton himself. But we have his letter, we have your testimony, and we have a manhunt underway across 3 territories. He won't get far." "Good," Elias said simply. "Justice delayed but not denied. That would have to satisfy him." The cavalry spent the day securing the site, documenting evidence, burying the outlaws' bodies in shallow graves that would serve until they could be properly dealt with. They offered to take Elias down to the valley to get him medical treatment and temporary housing. He declined, at least for now. There was something he needed to do first. He walked through the ruins of his cabin, sifting through ash and charred wood, looking for anything that might have survived. Most of it was gone, furniture burned to charcoal, supplies ruined by fire and water. His grandfather's tools, melted or warped beyond use. The books he'd read so many times, reduced to ash. But in the corner where his bed had been, protected by the stone foundation, he found the small metal box where he'd kept his most precious possessions. The box was blackened and hot to touch, but intact. Inside, protected by layers of cloth, was a photograph of Sarah on their wedding day. It had survived. Barely, the edges singed, but the image still visible. Her smile, captured 43 years ago, looked out at him with all the warmth and love he remembered. He also found, buried in the ash by the fireplace, a charred piece of the ring box that had held Sarah's wedding ring. The box was destroyed, but it didn't matter. The ring itself was still around his neck, warm against his skin, as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. That evening, Lieutenant Merrick woke up fully, coughing but coherent. Elias sat with him while the surgeon checked his vitals and declared him stable enough to talk. "You went after Cain alone," Merrick said, his voice rough from smoke damage. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Probably both," Elias admitted, "but it needed doing, and I was the only one available to do it. The captain told me." "You killed him," ended the threat. Merrick reached out and gripped Elias's arm weakly. "Thank you for everything, for holding the line, for saving me from that fire, for finishing what we started." "You're the one who held the line," Elias said. "You gave us time to circle around. You stood alone against 4 men and survived. That's not courage, Lieutenant. That's heroism." Merrick smiled faintly. "Then we're both heroes, or both fools. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." The cavalry company departed the next morning, taking Merrick on a stretcher, taking the evidence and the bodies, leaving Elias alone on the mountain with Scout and Keeper. The captain had offered again to take him down, had promised help rebuilding, had suggested he might be safer in the valley while Thornton was still at large. But Elias declined. He stood in the clearing where his cabin had been, looking at the mountains, stretching endlessly in all directions, and he realized something important. He'd climbed this mountain 5 years ago, running from pain. He'd built his cabin as a fortress against feeling. He'd isolated himself as protection against further loss. But isolation hadn't protected him. It had just delayed the inevitable. Life had found him anyway, brought him conflict and choice and connection, whether he wanted it or not. The dogs had found him. Cain had found him. Purpose had found him. And through it all, he'd discovered he was still capable of standing for something, of fighting for something, of caring about something beyond his own grief. Sarah would have been proud. More importantly, he was proud of himself for the first time in 5 years. He spent 3 days in the clearing, camping under canvas the cavalry had left him, thinking about what came next. The dogs stayed close, as if sensing he needed their companionship. Scout and Keeper had become his responsibility now, his connection to the world below. They couldn't stay on the mountain permanently. They deserved better than a lonely hermit and a burned foundation. On the morning of the 4th day, Elias packed what little he had salvaged, took one last look at the clearing that had been his home, and started down the mountain. Scout and Keeper walked beside him, no longer strays or stolen property, but companions who'd earned their place through loyalty and courage. The descent took most of the day. With each step down, the air grew warmer and thicker. Trees became more numerous, forest more dense. And somewhere below, hidden in the valley, was civilization with all its complications and demands. He was nervous about returning. 5 years away hadn't erased his grief over Sarah, hadn't healed the wounds that had driven him to isolation. But he carried her ring over his heart, and he carried the knowledge that he'd stood for something when it mattered. That was enough to build on. That was enough to start again. At the valley floor, he paused and looked back up at the mountain. The peak was hidden in clouds, mysterious and distant. Up there, a burned cabin marked where he'd made his stand. Up there, buried in shallow graves, lay men who'd learned the cost of crossing a stubborn rancher with 2 dogs to protect. He'd lived alone for 5 years, but he wouldn't live alone anymore. The dogs pressed against his legs, warm and solid and real. He had purpose now. He had testimony to give, justice to see through. He had a new chapter waiting to be written. Sarah's photograph was safe in his pack, her ring warm against his chest. She was gone, and that grief would never fully leave. But grief wasn't the same as death, and honoring her memory didn't require hiding from life. "Come on," he said to the dogs. "Let's go see what comes next." They started walking toward Timber Ridge, toward people and noise and all the messy complexity of the world he'd left behind. Elias Thorne, who'd spent 5 years running from pain, was finally ready to face it. And facing it, he discovered, felt a lot like coming home. The mountains watched him go, silent and eternal, holding their secrets. But Elias had learned the most important secret of all. Sometimes the simplest act of kindness, opening your door to freezing dogs, standing up for what's right, refusing to compromise on principles, changes everything. He'd opened his door to two dogs. They'd given him back his purpose. That was worth everything he'd lost. That was worth every bullet, every flame, every moment of terror. That was worth his life. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, Elias walked toward his future with two faithful dogs at his side, Sarah's memory in his heart, and peace he hadn't felt in 5 years, finally settling over him like a blessing. Sometimes the hardest journeys bring us exactly where we need to be. Sometimes losing everything helps us find what truly matters. And sometimes the courage to stand for two innocent animals reveals the courage to stand for yourself. The cowboys and dogs had come full circle. The mountain had been their